We are approaching the end of the series. We're not quite there, but we've had a great lineup of speakers. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips. I'm Associate Dean of the University Honors College. And if you're watching this on video, welcome. And all of you, of course, welcome to our series on spaces and places. Our speaker today comes to us from the English department. Dr. Laura White is Professor of English and affiliate faculty with the Women's and Gender Studies program and Africana Studies program here at Middle Tennessee State University. She has spoken in at least one prior lecture series, maybe more. Her teaching and research focus on global literatures written in English with a particular emphasis on issues of gender and environment. Her book, Ecospectrality, Haunting and Environmental Justice in Contemporary Anglophone Novels, which I have here. This is a library copy, so when I return it, you are free to check it out of the library. This book explores how literary hauntings can manifest environmental threats and circulate environmental knowledge. With her current project, she seeks to extend conversations about emotion and extinction narratives. Instead of focusing on individual environmental feelings such as grief or hope, her work explores how effects move through extinction narratives and challenges assumptions about connections between feeling and environmental action. Her presentation today, titled Soil Stories, Feminist Composting and Historical Memory in Australian Fiction, fits well into our series and adds another disciplinary perspective to our theme. I'm especially excited about this presentation too because it's going to make its way into a book that I'm editing called Eco-Critical Approaches to World Literature and Culture. So please join me in welcoming Dr. White.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be joining you today and participating in the conversations that you've been having about space and place. I want to thank Dr. Phillips for inviting me to share about the research that I have been doing and bring a perspective on how I talk about place in the field of English studies and in environmental humanities. I have narrowed down the title a little bit to focus on a particular book that I'm going to concentrate on today, but I think otherwise the title does give you a fair expectation of what we're going to talk about. We are going to talk about soil and history, but we are also going to talk about a few other things that I want to make sure is clear from the very start. We are going to be talking about human death and death rituals, as well as animal death and disposal of animal bodies as part of our discussion today. The slides are going to include images of graves and pictures of a real mouse plague that happened in Australia. And this is going to include a picture of a pile of mouse bodies. So I do want you to know that these images might be disturbing, but they're also crucial to the points that I want to make today about how place is connected to time and generations, to interdependencies, and to the processes that connect life and death. I will mention it again before I show the mouse slide in case that's something that you don't feel like you are ready to deal with today, but I do hope that you will come along with me for an exploration of space and place in terms of soil and composting. And so my first question for you for today is, how much time do you spend thinking about soil? For some of you, you might tend to garden, you might work on a farm or a ranch, you might build things in the ground, and so the answer to that might be, I spend an awful lot of time thinking about soil. I have a language for it. Anybody fit into that camp? Anybody spend a lot of time day to day thinking about soil? Nobody? Nobody has a garden? No? Wow, okay. So then everybody falls into that other camp, the people who don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about soil. In your day-to-day, you might be spending your time in classrooms, you might be spending your time doing research, reading books, you might not have daily encounters with soil, and there might not be things that prompt you to think a whole lot about soil. And so that leads into thinking about soil and the field of knowledge around soil. So there are soil scientists, there are soil networks that have developed in different places around the globe who answer this question. People don't spend nearly enough time thinking about soil, and they want to facilitate ways for thinking about soil and preserving and transmitting soil knowledge. So they have websites, they have meetings, they try to archive, preserve, and disperse knowledge about soil because they see it as crucial to all kinds of issues, not just to gardening or farming, but to human health, to planetary health. Writers also have a critical part to play in our thinking about soil. Writers like Wendell Berry have written nonfiction studies where they think about the importance of soil and culture, and they try to give us opportunities to recognize the importance of soils to life. So this is a quote from Wendell Berry, who really emphasizes in powerful ways the importance of soil to life. Wendell Berry is local to us, a writer from Kentucky who has thought deeply about agriculture and culture. Has anybody read works by Wendell Berry before? Come across Wendell Berry before? We've got one? Okay, so if you are interested in local context, Wendell Berry is a great writer to check out and investigate, and there are local American contexts for soil discussions. But today I'm going to take us a little bit further afield. I'm going to focus on Australian context and the work of Australian novelist Charlotte Wood, particularly her novel Stoneyard Devotional. And I want to look at the ways that it uses composting and suggest that she talks about it as a material practice, collecting garden scraps and using the processes of decay to turn them into fertilizer for feeding the soil, feeding plants. But I'm also suggesting that she's using it as a metaphorical practice that helps us think about relationship to place in terms of responsibilities that go across generations, and to think about human bodies and human stories as part of the soil community. So humans are not totally separate, but instead part of the soil community. So a little bit of background about Wood. She's an Australian novelist who's published 7 novels, 3 nonfiction books. Anybody come across Charlotte Wood before? All right, that one I'm not surprised about. So she is an Australian novelist. She had earlier works like The Natural Way of Things that got some prizes and some popular attention in Australia. I regularly teach it as part of my global English classes at the undergraduate and graduate level. Definitely recommend it as a book to check out. But Stoneyard Devotional has really put her on the global literary map. It was shortlisted for the 2024 Booker Prize, which is a high-profile global literary prize. And so that got her reviews in a lot of prominent journals, got her a lot more attention as a writer. I also want to think about the specific context of Australia. How many people are familiar with Australia? Have you read any Australian literature, traveled to Australia, studied Australian history a little bit? Okay, so we've got some familiarity with Australia, but starting off with a map and visualizing where Australia is, the part of Australia in which the novel is set. The Monaro region is part of New South Wales, and that is the pink state that is highlighted there. So it's a small part of that area. South and east in that section, left of the little moon that is the Australian Capital Territory. So the map gives us a visual orientation to Australia and the part of the world that we're going to be set in, but the map also gives us a way to start thinking about the ways that we engage with places. So sharing maps and photographs, like I will on the slides, is a way to acquaint you with the Monaro Plains, a place that you might not have seen or read about before, a place that you might not be familiar with. Because there are key aspects of place that we can understand just by looking at them, by seeing them, by visualizing them, and our knowledge systems work a lot on vision and the prominence of vision. Maps provide a way for us to visualize place. Photographs can give us a glimpse of a place at a specific moment in time. But part of what I want us to think about today is how novels are able to mobilize stories, how they're able to use stories about soil in general and composting in particular, to help us think about place in connection to more than what we can see, in connections to multiple generations and long processes of time. Wood spends a fair amount of time directly discussing soil and composting, but she also contrasts composting with other forms of burial, human burial, the burial and disposal of animal remains among them, encouraging us to think about how living in a place in the present makes us responsible to those remains. The remains are physical, but they're also narrative and conceptual, generations of lives and deaths of multiple species, plants, animals, and humans, but also the stories and the concepts that make a place what it is and that either make life possible or threaten life for the generations that follow along with it. I'm going to suggest that this kind of attention to soil and composting leads not just to us thinking about the importance of soil, like the folks in the soil organizations would do, but also to a different understanding of this particular novel than most critics have come to. So I want to tell you a little bit about the plot of the novel and the way that critics have reacted to it. And the cover also gives you another feel for the landscape that we are dealing with here. So in this novel, there's a central unnamed female character who leaves her job in an environmental organization that's focused on saving endangered species. And she chooses to take up living with a group of nuns in a convent in a town that's near where she grew up. She's drawn to the convent not because of any sense of religious devotion. She's not a believer and she does not want to become a nun herself, but she's captivated by the rituals and the routines of life at the convent. Her husband and her co-workers are deeply hurt by her choice. They accuse her of abdicating her responsibility, and critics have tended to follow suit. As you can see in some of the reviews that I've highlighted here, they fault the character and the novel in terms of its depiction of stillness as a retreat from ethical responsibility or as presenting a troubling kind of passivity in the face of crisis. Critics frequently mention that the novel was written during the forced stillness of the COVID pandemic and at a time in the writer's life when she and her two sisters had just been diagnosed with the form of cancer that had killed their mother. Wood and her sisters are all doing fine now, but critics use this context to suggest that the novel dwells on death and paints a bleak, pessimistic picture of retreating from the world. I'm suggesting something totally different, that critics reach these conclusions because they're also not paying enough attention to soil. If we look at how the main character relates to soil and composting, she's not retreating from the world and action at all. Instead, she's rejecting particular forms of action. She's rejecting a capitalist system of production and consumption and modes of environmental activism that are situated within those frameworks. Her choice to move to the convent doesn't mean she's abandoning the world. She's moving into a different mode of relationship. Instead of trying to save individual species through fundraising and social media campaigns, she was working in an urban office. She instead moves to this space where she can rebuild a sense of herself as a member of a specific and multi-species community. The community includes the inhabitants in the present, but also demands reckoning with material remains and the dynamic processes that link life and death. This in turn allows for reckoning with narrative and conceptual inheritances that shape how we understand human responsibilities and how we make judgments about what counts as environmental action. So let's talk a little bit about composting. Anybody here involved in composting? Yes, we have quite a few people saying yes to composting. Okay. So you may have encountered it in different kinds of ways. I have a picture here of the Nashville Farmers Market that started asking vendors to compost in 2015 and putting out these bins for consumers to compost in 2019. So the green is for compost, the blue is for recycling, the black on the end is for landfill trash. This kind of sorting of material might help us to also see how composting is a material process, but also lends itself to metaphorical ways of thinking. The labels on the trash cans push us to start thinking about what garbage or waste is, and when we're throwing things away because they're no longer useful, making us aware that there might be ways to reconsider those distinctions, might be ways for us to see that what's dead or used up can actually contribute to future forms of life. Eco-critical theorists have thought about compost in these terms too, as a material practice of caring for the soil, but also suggesting that we can use composting as a conceptual model or metaphor for thinking about responsibility, collaboration, and legacy. So before we go to the novel, I want to tell you a little bit about some of those environmental thinkers who have influenced the way that I'm thinking about compost and soil. Donna Haraway. In the book Staying with the Trouble, Donna Haraway identifies the importance of the thoughts that we think with. This might seem like a really obvious connection, and she actually borrows it and attributes it to a thinker that influenced her, saying, the thoughts that we think with matter. She elaborates on that in the quotation that I have put up here, but she's emphasizing that the ideas that we use shape the conversations we're able to have, the things we're able to notice, the conclusions we're able to draw. As she builds out this idea, she focuses on the concept of the human. And she says that the concept of the human that we're used to as being individual, bounded actors, agents, is something that's not a useful idea to think with anymore in our contemporary moment. She says it's also out of date with current scientific understandings of life and death, but it continues to influence the conversations that we have because it's an idea that we're used to. Instead, she argues that we need to think about humans in terms of relationality and their position not as outside, but as parts of dynamic systems. So instead of seeing humans as impermeable, isolated beings, we start to understand humans as parts of systems of living and dying. And focusing on soil and composting provides us with a way to do just that, to relocate humans as not outside of systems, but as part of systems, not as acting within an environment or within a place, but as actually being very materially part of place. Does that make sense? So other scholars take up similar kinds of work, particularly paying attention to soil. So Haraway is thinking more about ideas of the human, whereas scholars like Maria Puig de la Bellacasa thinks a lot about soil itself. And she thinks about ethics of care in relationship to soil. You might have noticed that word care starting to show up. It was in Barry's reflection on the importance of soil, and it shows up again here in this definition of composting. Puig de la Bellacasa's scholarship emphasizes how approaches to soil can support or obstruct relationships of care, especially in connection with the way that they position the human. So she says that soil is not just a habitat or medium for plants and organisms, nor is it just decomposed material, the organic and mineral end product of organism activity. Although that is a common way of thinking about soil, if we see soil in that way as just a product or a background for human or other life forms, then it doesn't really inspire a whole lot of care. It's just this inert thing. But what she's arguing is a conceptual shift. If we think about organisms as soil, a lively soil exists when we think about it as and in terms of the multi-species interactions that make it. And if we think about it that way, that puts humans in relationship with a whole range of other living things, with earthworms, with bacteria, and in colonial contexts like Australia, with animals like rabbits and sheep that settlers brought to the land and that had a dramatic impact of reshaping and impacting the conditions of the soil. Composting is one specific way to call attention to soil as lively collaborative matter. As the scholars say here, it's a material labor through which old scraps are transformed through practices of care and attention. Composting requires attention and intention, and stories about soil and composting can help readers pay attention to active biological processes happening at scales and in spaces that might escape visual detection. So if we're not usually thinking about soil or interacting with soil or dealing with soil directly on a day-to-day basis, it makes sense that these are things that we're not thinking about. But scholars and creative writers can help us, give us active soil and soil communities as concepts to think with, as stories to influence the world with. So that gets us into, why does this matter? Puig de la Bellacasa's work addresses the ways that humans are usually positioned not as part of the soil community, but as outside of it, as interrupters and destroyers, or as victims of damage and pollution. In contrast, she argues that models of care can reconfigure these relationships and create different understandings so that humans are included more decisively in the concept of soil as members of the soil community. Wood's novel also investigates models of care grounded in soil, demonstrating and extending this kind of scholarly conversation that positions humans as members of a soil community. The novel contains multiple passages that directly depict the material practice of composting. And novelistic descriptions of composting, you can start to get a feeling for why critics are saying this is a pretty slow-paced novel. It's not about fast action scenes, but there's also a lot more than just describing the practice of composting. I'm drawing on these theorists to suggest that she also constructs the novel as a kind of narrative composting, and specifically a feminist composting, that includes attention to ways that attitudes about care and generations, fertility in particular, are gendered parts not just of biological processes, but cultural systems, cultural processes. The novel strategically places together the lives and deaths of a variety of different species, probing connections and distinctions between composting and burial, and between human and animal life and fertility, death and death rituals. I'm suggesting that she's mixing these ingredients together, enacting a kind of composting process that encourages us to confront responsibilities that we miss when we don't pay attention to these as intersecting processes, when we just think about these as isolated issues. All right, as we start to move into discussion of the novel, I just want to lay out and sort of re-articulate the different levels of thinking about composting that I want us to pursue. So feminist composting as a material labor, the actual practice of caring for the soil and collecting these materials and reconnecting with cycles of living and dying, but also feminist composting as a literary practice, as part of what the novel is doing by putting all these different stories and different ingredients together. The stories are also gendered in terms of their focus on mother-daughter relationships and some of the impact of the Catholic Church and its policing of fertility. So the character is living at a convent, and she is aware of and brings into the discussion some of the church's past in terms of practices and teachings about fertility. And lastly, I want us to think about composting and its potential as a scholarly practice. As we do our work as scholars, thinking and calling attention to the ingredients that we use to think with. What ideas do we put together into conversation, and how does that impact the way that we act in the world and the kinds of scholarship that we do? All right, so let's look at some details from the novel. For the central character, composting is a legacy deeply tied to her own mother. She reveals, composting was one of the things my mother did that other mothers did not do. In our town, when I was a child, deliberately leaving vegetables and bones to rot in your own backyard was not something that nice people did. She distinguishes the care that her mother devotes to composting from the junk heaps that other families had in their yards, and she also shares a realization that for her mother, the garden was her personal realm, in a way that, quote, the kitchen or the home was supposed to be the domain of women at that time. Instead of keeping her bound into gendered norms of occupying domestic space, the garden serves a role for her mother in legitimizing her desire to help things grow in different kinds of ways. In hindsight, the main character recognizes that her mother had an abiding connection to the soil, and this is the quote that is on the screen for you. My mother used to hold out a heap of garden soil in two cupped hands, marveling, calling me to sniff and feel the moist black clumps, to see the pink worms coming from them. Sometimes it seemed she loved the earth itself more than the plants. So I think that's an important aspect as well. For her mother, composting is an end in itself. It's a relationship with the earth. It's not just about serving another purpose. It's not just about fortifying the plants, but about a relationship of care with the earth that defies gender norms and traditional practices of human mothering. For the main character, living at the convent is providing her with a chance to experience a similar kind of link to the earth. a connection with the soil, and a chance to tune into the interdependence of life and death, while she's also, I think in significant ways, rejecting the choice to be a biological mother. She's choosing this other way of connecting to processes of life and death. These choices are not socially recognized or valued, and the novel goes out of its way to point that out. Her friends see her choice to leave her job in an activist organization as a rejection of the world, and the neighboring farmer's wife describes these women living in an isolated female community as unnatural. But Wood doesn't seem to be validating that judgment. Instead, she seems to be exploring how these choices point toward the making of a different kind of world. The central character explains, quote, "I shoveled the compost and spread it, shoveled and spread, preparing the soil and waiting for things to make sense. Tried to attend very softly and quietly, which is the closest I can get to prayer." The movement of spreading out soil, tending and attending to the rhythms of the earth moves the central character out of systems of paid labor, out of capitalism, marriage, and biological motherhood, but into a different form of relation, a different kind of responsibility for living and dying in this community, as she becomes the one responsible for growing and cooking the community's food. Composting thus serves as a way for this character to connect with the soil community, but it also serves as a device to investigate and contrast models of history and time. So here we're going to get into some of the bigger conceptual, metaphorical aspects. The generative processes of composting are juxtaposed with a range of other forms of burial. Burials of human and animal remains, and burials of stories that countries, organizations, and families want to keep hidden from view. The novel moves across time, layering the central character's life in the convent in the present, with memories of her childhood and her mother, and with the story of a nun who used to live in the convent, Sister Jenny. Sister Jenny left Australia years before because she felt called to work with poor, abused women. She went to Thailand and established a center, and she was suspected murdered there after she took in a woman who claimed that an American Catholic priest had assaulted her. Years later, a flood causes a tree outside the priest's house to fall, and Sister Jenny's bones are discovered, tangled up in the tree's roots. Beyond recovering Jenny's physical remains, this evocative resurfacing of bones represents a return of repressed past and the need to reckon with the stories of abuse that the church had tried to silence. It suggests a pattern of haunting when stories and matter refuse to stay buried and return to demand attention. And Dr. Phillips told you a little bit about my interest in haunting, that like this return of the past to view is something that I think is something that storytellers have helped us to grapple with, but I think composting actually gives us a different framework for thinking about it than haunting. That this idea that instead of just burying things and having them return, we can bury them and have them transform, have them fuel life in different kinds of ways. The central character never knew Sister Jenny when she was alive, but she becomes involved in this struggle over the bones. The sisters fight to bring the bones to the nunnery, where their idea is that they can visit her grave, tend a garden on it, kneel beside her, and smooth grasses over her body. The vision that they're fighting for is for Jenny's bones to become part of their community, in a literal way, burying her bones there, but also to reclaim the story of her murder, to let it be brought to light and be reckoned with, incorporated into the present, so that her death feeds the survival of others in both physical and symbolic ways. So that's just one of the many death rituals that get put into contact throughout the story. The death and burial of Sister Jenny also intersect with the main character, returning to her hometown and visiting her parents' grave for the first time in 35 years. She remarks on the coldness and sterility of their resting place. She describes a dull, flat expanse filled with gently curved rows of low, ugly headstones of identical dimensions, no lawn, just dusty grass. The lifeless appearance of the land is tied to a detached, industrialized relationship with death. The central character recalls, this is the quote we have here, "It seemed callous to me to lower a person into a hole in the ground using ropes and cords instead of arms." And she looks at the machine cut and polished pieces of stone and ugly plastic flowers. She finds no trace of either of my parents. that commercialized rituals sanitize death, making it orderly, making it sterile. And this distance from the materiality of death contrasts with the death and burial of Sister Jenny, and also with the deaths of the animals and the responsibility for their bodies that the main character encounters at the convent. One of the earliest moments that she narrates about her life at the convent involves finding a baby chick who had frozen to death. She decides that she's going to bury the chick. But she does think first, I could have put the little chick into the compost, but it seemed disrespectful. So I want to think about that a little bit and why that would be disrespectful. As a domestic animal, the chick is valued. So adding its body to the compost is considered a lack of respect. It's considered to be something that deserves more respect. But burying this chick and raising that question about what kinds of honor and respect different creatures get in life and in death raises all these other stories. Quote, when I pushed the shovel blade into the ground, what came to me were the mass graves in which nuns, Irish, American, Canadian, why not also Australian, had buried babies they called illegitimate. So Wood uses this one short scene of burying the dead chick on the farm to activate this historical context, showing how the struggle to grow crops and protect chickens in the present moment is also connected to this historical cultural context of control over fertility. She thinks, when I tamped down the little chicken's grave with my own black boot, I thought of those babies and those poor girls, and the savagery came flooding in once again. Yet here I am. Wrestle, wrestle. She acknowledges that the space of quiet reflection the convent is providing her in the present moment can't be detached from this history that involved violent acts of control. And all of this becomes visible, gets brought to the surface because Wood is paying attention to soil and spending all this time telling us the stories of the soil. Okay, now we're going to get to the mice. These burials also contrast with the disposal of the bodies of mice that plagued the farm in the neighboring areas. The novel references a real plague of mice that happened in Australia, and images of mice, it seems like, strike a deep chord with Wood. She also has frightful descriptions of mouse fertility in some of her other works, like The Natural Way of Things. But like I said, this is an actual event and an image from a news story that accompanied the coverage of the plague. And most of the images that accompanied the news stories displayed piles of dead mouse bodies, so that the spectacle of mouse death became part of the way that humans were managing and dealing with this crisis. In the novel, instead of turning death into a visual display, humans struggle with the materiality. What are they supposed to do with all of these mice? And if they kill the mice, what do they do with all of these mouse bodies? They reflect, we have to do something about disposing the bodies. We've been flinging them over the back fence, behind the pine trees, into the paddock, but they're piling up and the stench is worsening. We need to be rid of them, bury or destroy them, not just because of the smell, but because the simple fact of them is so horrifying. So very different from the chick that she was thinking about deserved the respect of an individual burial, the mice present a problem because of their existence, because they're a horrifying threat to the other members of the community. Questions of death here become enmeshed with the threat of uncontrolled fertility, and killing the mice becomes figured as a necessary choice that allows others to survive. One of the nuns repeats the advice of the neighboring farmer. Our duty now is to control the mice, which means killing as many as possible. They struggle with this demand, and they question what would happen if we did nothing. What can we afford to lose, and what has to be protected? Eva Hefe-Gerard is a theorist who I quote here. She explores related concerns when she thinks about models of entanglement and what that means for ethical decisions. She argues for the need to center acts of exclusion. So instead of just thinking about collaboration and unity and inclusion, we need to think about exclusion. And she suggests that exclusion can be a site where accountability is taken, not just for who or what is classified as worthy of consideration, but for which worlds are materialized over others. To make her point, she draws on another scholar who talks about slugs in gardens, and she points out the need for exclusions. You've got to get rid of the slugs to allow the other elements of the garden to thrive. And she quotes his phrasing about creating spaces around hoped-for absence rather than relation. I want to mention this because I want to complicate her interpretation. This isn't just a hoped-for absence. This is active work that's being described to keep slugs and other elements out of gardens. Building barriers around plants, crushing or salting the slugs is a form of relation. It's not a hoped-for action. It's not a hoped-for absence, but a choice to work for the exclusion and destruction of a specific being that's figured as a threat. So that means relation isn't just about cooperation and care. It isn't just an unqualified positive thing. Killing is not a lack of relation at all, but a very intimate relation. And killing mice enables the world that the women inhabit alongside plants and other animals. Living at the convent puts the central character in direct negotiation with this reality. So it's no longer abstract ideas about extinction or survival, but it's choices that she's making on a day-to-day basis. She might unsubscribe from all of her activist social media accounts, but it's a mistake to see that as a lack of responsibility, a lack of connection to the world. Instead, her relocation enables her to reveal that one form of activism is just one limited model. It's not the entire world. Other forms of relationship, other forms of environmental action, other forms of ethical response are possible. Getting to the end. At the novel's end, Sister Jenny's bones are laid to rest by human arms rather than ropes, and the central character remembers her childhood dog being buried in her family's garden. She leaves us in closing the novel with a final meditation on compost, and here it is. My mother said that anything that had once been alive should go back into the soil. Food scraps went into the compost, of course, including meat and bones, despite the general advice against this. Paper torn into strips to allow air and microbes to move freely through. All that was needed was time and nature. Anything that lived could make itself useful, become nourishment in death, my mother said. In this way, the novel joins some of the theorists I described at the start of the talk, who are thinking about active soil and soil communities. But the novel also doesn't paint this as just a romantic story of unity and collaboration. It confronts us with responsibilities and dependencies we might rather not have to see, as well as making us think about distinctions in how humans treat this anything that had once been alive. Everything, as we've seen in the novel, is not treated in the same way. And the repetition of the phrase "my mother said" that opens and closes this passage points us back to a gendered legacy of this as a responsibility and a kind of knowledge that's being passed along from mother to daughter, and as potential kind of matter that can build a specific kind of world, to go back to Haraway's terms. As we go back to some of those theoretical terms where we started from, I want to reiterate that novels like Wood's have an important part to play in shaping what soil stories become the ideas we think with, become the resources we can use to discuss place and imagine how we inhabit places in environmentally and ethically sound ways. If we look at soil with our human eyes, we might just see stillness and miss all the action. I'm suggesting the same applies for Wood's novel. It's not just filled with action heroes fighting battles, but that also doesn't mean it's dwelling in despair or encouraging a refusal of responsibility. Instead, I want to suggest it's opening doors to other ways that we could respond, encouraging us to retune our senses and attend to the vast material and narrative networks that are soil communities. I've been trying to foreground the potential of composting as a storytelling practice and to experiment with feminist composting as a scholarly practice, calling attention to the voices and concepts drawn together here. And I join these other environmental theorists in affirming that the work of care and critical reflection, the work that we can do as scholars, is not a passive retreat from the world, but it's a vital part of sustaining it. So these are the ideas that Wood offers us to think with. And I would love to talk with you more about these ideas or any questions you have about any of the things that I have been talking to you about.
Questions, comments?
What do you think about these ideas as resources that we can use to think with?
I think the stories help to connect a lot. Just having that person like relationship helps connect with the soil. So the stories and sharing those, I feel like, is a good thing.
Okay, yeah. So I think part of your whole process in having an interdisciplinary series is thinking about different ways of knowing, right? So that stories provide us with a specific way of knowing. So I could give you all the facts about the makeup of Australia's soil, but hearing the story about how one person is connecting with the soil gives us a different way to think about things. Yeah, for sure. Anybody else? Other thoughts about how we can use soil as a concept to think with, or any questions about anything?
Is like composting and working with soil and like inherently feminist to you, or do you have any other? I don't know what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to ask, and it was something that I was thinking too. I'm not sure. There's so many things that I want to talk about, and I get so excited to talk about ideas that I'm not sure if I did make it clear enough what the feminist part of this is. So is composting inherently feminist? I don't think it has to be, and I guess that's also part of the point about the language that we use as well, that we could talk about it in really scientific terms and talk about, the oxygenation and the microbial action and that kind of stuff as a process of composting. But I think highlighting it as a relationship of care and thinking about it also in terms of gendered dynamics of labor, of who's usually performing that labor and how does that factor into the stories that get told and the kinds of things that sort of count as work. I think that's part of what makes the discussion feminist. And I think the book highlights that by making it something that's passed on between mothers and daughters. So a lot of the soil network associations, they have stories of farmers and their practices on their websites as a way of circulating knowledge. A lot of those are stories of men and the stories of how they're managing their large family farms and ranches. So I think that focusing on the kind of knowledge and the context of passing it down orally between mother and daughter is something else that gets us thinking about the dynamics of knowledge production as well as the kinds of labor that are involved. So I think that's a great question.
When you were describing how she didn't know what to do with the chick,
Yeah.
right before that, you would so beautifully describe the way that she associates composting with her mother and how it's like this creative act. Is there a point in the book where she thinks about that as well, where she's like, while she's thinking about the chick, she's like, oh, but my mother did this, and with her it was so beautiful, and if I put the chick in the ground, it's disrespectful?
So yeah, I think it is a process that she goes through of part of returning to the convent, I think, is part of also creating space for her to deal with her past and to deal with these memories of her mother and of some of the other relationships she's had with people and with animals in her past. So absolutely, it is not just a single composting is always this or always that. It's a process of remembering her relationship with her mother. And again, there wasn't time to include everything. There's also a lamb that dies, and this was not just an individual creature, but a name. The lamb was Violet. And at that point, she's able to bury the lamb and think about that as a kind of returning the lamb to the soil system in a way that she wasn't there yet when the chick was at the beginning of her time at the convent. And I think by the time it gets to the burying the lamb, that she's also evolved a little bit in her processing of what it means to relate to the soil in that kind of way.
When she talks about the not using the arms to lower bodies, does she talk about composting our bodies in terms of burial versus cremation or anything like that?
Yeah, I also think that's a great question and something that had me thinking of that. She seems, when she visits her parents' grave early on, that it is really highlighting the sort of alienation that some human death rituals create. And in some of the interviews, a lot of people talk to her about her own thoughts about death because, like I mentioned, her mother died when she was fairly young and she was facing her own mortality while she was writing this book. in terms of thinking about how death rituals sometimes can try to create a sense of finality and closure and a sense of something being done and finished, rather than this process that we're talking about through composting. And it seems like that's definitely something that she was thinking about, was how do humans fit into this process, and how can they be, how can we maybe rethink some of our death rituals to emphasize process and connection and regeneration, instead of this idea of, in sort of spatial metaphors, putting it behind us, getting over it, having ongoing relationship with the ground and the earth. She wasn't finding any trace of her parents in that sort of sterile burial site, but she does not go as far as any kind of direct sort of discussion of green burial or things like that. And these are also things that are happening in different parts of the world as we hear about sort of pressures on land use from land development and things like that, that there are communities that are running out of burial sites. So having community discussions about human death rituals is also something that is very much part of the backdrop of this, but not something that she directly discusses.
That was great, because I was kind of thinking about the death rituals and stuff as well, and I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on, I saw this video that it just made me think of it. This girl had created a biodegradable casket out of like leaves and different things like that. What are some maybe practical ideas that we could do? What are the benefits of those, and like maybe some of the drawbacks?
Yeah, so there are whole movements around green burial of thinking about, how some of our rituals, in terms of human death rituals, prevent processes and prevent the sort of part of, I think, what she's trying to draw our attention to is our shared mortality connects us to all these other things and connects us to these processes of decay and regeneration. But as humans, sometimes we don't want to think about that, and we want to separate ourselves out from that. And I think that's exactly what she's challenging us to think about. With Sister Jenny, I think that's the closest that she gets, that there aren't, thinking about the regulations that we have also about human burial. So it's a matter of cultural rituals, but it is also a matter of sometimes legal regulations. So they want to bring her bones back and incorporate her into the community in that physical way, to bury her bones on the land, but they have to go through all this kind of bureaucratic maneuvering to get permission to put human bones on their property. So I think it doesn't offer those, it doesn't offer a roadmap to that, but I'm really excited about this because I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to suggest, that stories like this, they don't just tell us what the answers are, but they give us these tools to think with. They prompt us to have these conversations and raise these questions, and then think about how might that connect to our communities? How might that connect to our rituals? And what's the value of thinking about different forms of connection and different forms of rituals without telling us, this is how we go about promoting green burials.
We have one more question.
Oh, sorry.
You said that the main character had to confront the past practices of illegitimate children for the Catholic Church. What are the past practices of the illegitimate children for the Catholic Church?
So the issues that she's referring to, you might have seen there are a variety of different documentaries and novels recently that have been also trying to engage with some of those stories that haven't really been told. And I think here in this book, they're just kind of hinted at that in addition to sort of just cultural stigma about unwed mothers, that there is this label of illegitimate being attached to children, but there were also children that were being taken away from mothers because they weren't considered to be proper mothers. So there's a whole deep, really complicated history of motherhood and construction of motherhood and I think the implication there that they weren't just taking away the babies, but that they were burying the babies. That's a story that has been buried, and that like I said, now has been coming to light and has been something that people are talking a little bit about in terms of how do we reconcile that, the different ways that human lives and human deaths are treated.
Was there another question I missed over here?
Yeah, I'm sorry if you said it and I didn't hear, but what did they decide to do with the rats?
So they try a whole bunch of different things for the rats. They go through a variety of different kinds of ways to try to deter them, but they do wind up taking lethal measures against the rats.
Like to bury them.
Oh, to bury them, they get the farmer they go through some of these like quicker, like just throwing them away, burying them. They actually have to get the farmer and his mechanical tools to build a pit big enough for them to bury and dispose of the mice, because there are that many of them, yeah. And again, thinking about that of how do we justify killing and treatment of bodies in those different ways, that it's not providing easy answers to those really difficult ethical questions, but it's making us think about them rather than saying just these are things we don't want to look at and things we'd rather not think about.
Join me in thanking our speaker today.
Thank you so much for having me.